5 minutes.
And that's what I thought. Okay, thank you, Cancorda. And thank you, Minister. As the Minister knows, Broin is an emergency hostel here in the City of Dublin. It has 101 beds, opened in October of last year on a temporary basis and is run by Crosscare, the homeless service provider. It provides emergency accommodation on a night-by-night basis and works to place people in more secure emergency accommodation and in permanent housing. It's proved incredibly successful, Minister, and in fact, since it opened, over 200 people have been successfully moved on to better quality and better supported emergency accommodation, and in a number of cases to permanent housing. As you know, the lease between Dublin City Council and the Digital Hub was temporary and it was due to close in April of this year. And it's important to emphasise that this is a publicly owned premises, ultimately under the auspices of the new Department of Communications. And my understanding is, while the Digital Hub would ultimately like to sell this premises, there is no immediate alternative use for it. Since the Broin opened, unfortunately we know the homeless crisis across the state and here in the city has worsened. The Homeless Executive did their rough sleeper count on the 24th of April, and they found on that particular night 102 people were sleeping rough in the city, a 10% increase on the previous count. On the same night, 70 people in addition were in the Merchants Quay Night Cafe, and all emergency beds in the city that night were occupied, including Broin. Since the end of April, Broin is being wound down. It was first restricted to 80 beds, and since the 9th of this month, the free phone service which places people in Broin has been instructed not to make any more placements, which means it's essentially reduced to 43 beds a night. Minister, at the same time, the average number of people turned away from emergency accommodation by the Central Placement Service on any given night is between 50 and 60 people. So these are people who ring up in search of day-to-day or night-to-night emergency accommodation, and they are told there is simply no accommodation for them. And I've spoken to a number of people who work in the homeless sector in the city today, and they are telling us under no certain terms that there has been an increase in the number of people sleeping rough as a direct result of the reduction in the beds in Broin. In fact, even if Broin was operating to full capacity, the city would need more emergency beds. So I have a number of questions, Minister. The first is, do you believe that it is acceptable for Broin to close if the result is more people being forced to sleep rough in the city? Has the Minister raised this matter directly with his counterpart Denis Naughton, who ultimately has responsibility for the facility in terms of the ownership of the premises, with Dublin City Council, with the Homeless Executive, or indeed with Broin themselves? And what I'd say, Minister, is if you haven't done any of those things, you need to pick up the phone to Denis Naughton and seek his direct intervention with the Board of Digital Hub to ensure that this facility isn't closed as is currently planned at the end of this month. I'd also respectfully suggest, Minister, that you need to talk directly to Eoin Keegan, who not only is obviously the City Manager in Dublin City, but also is on the Board of Digital Hub and has a key role to play in this. And in my own view, there are two very simple messages that I think all of the players on this issue need to hear. The first is that those 100 beds that would effectively be removed from the Dublin emergency accommodation system if Broin was to close should not be lost to the system. In fact, we need more beds, not less. And that nobody should be sleeping rough in Dublin when there are tonight 60 vacant beds in Broin. Thank you, Cancorda.
Thank you very much, Minister. Mr. Coveney.
Deputy, I presume you'll get a copy of the official response, but let me just answer some of the questions directly. First of all, can I agree that certainly having been speaking to a number of people who are sleeping rough in Dublin and who are looking for hostel accommodation, Broin is a very popular choice. It's seen as safe. It's seen as one of the higher standard accommodation hostels that are available for people who are looking for sheltered accommodation who otherwise are forced to sleep rough. So while I don't have a direct responsibility in terms of the allocation of beds in Dublin, and you know how that system works, so you don't need me to tell you, I certainly have a policy responsibility here, The answer to your question is yes, I have spoken to Dublin City Council. Yes, I have spoken to Eoin Keegan about this issue, as has my Secretary General again in the last couple of days. The Dublin City Council Chief Executive has written to either the board or management in the Digital Hub Agency to see whether now we can extend the availability of Broinshire as a facility for sheltered accommodation. I think it's important, though, to understand what had happened and how Broinshire came into the system. This was a response for a winter response, if you like, to rough sleeping. And because it was so successful, if you like, it became a very popular choice. There have been attempts, as would be normal after a winter period, to try and wind down facilities, to essentially move them out of providing sheltered accommodation after the winter months. But given the extent of the numbers rough sleeping, which latest count was 102, compared to last year, actually, that's a much reduced figure, but it's still a very significant figure. Right? My judgment is that, given the fact that there's another hostel being taken out of operation, I think it's Focus Ireland hostel is being forced to do that for a series of other reasons. I do think, my judgment is that if we were to take Broinshire out of the provision of hostel accommodation, it would result in people being forced to sleep in the streets who otherwise wouldn't be there. It's my view. And so I've asked the Chief Executive of Dublin City Council to try and ensure that it can stay open. And my understanding is that he has written to seek an extension of the lease for 12 months, and also to look for it to be at full capacity, which is 100 people, as opposed to the 40 or so that it's been facilitating in recent weeks in an attempt to try and wind it down. So you're not the only one who's been raising this with me, and most importantly, actually, the clients of Broinshire have raised it directly with me. I think we had a regrettable incident last week, which I hope will not happen again in other hostels, that are part of an agreed wind down, where we had protests where staff were intimidated, and that is not what we want from protesters, actually, not from people staying there. So that hasn't contributed to this decision, and it in some ways has made it more difficult. But I hope, and I can't confirm that Broinshire will be available for another 12 months yet. What I can confirm is that the request has gone in, and I will speak to Dennis Naughton about it, to ensure that we do what we can to extend for 12 months. And in that period of time, there's going to be a very significant effort from me and from government to actually make a big impact on rough sleeping in Dublin. It is just not acceptable that we have the numbers that we have forced to sleep in the streets. There's a lot of complex reasons why people find themselves there. Addiction, mental health, family breakdown, so many other complex reasons. It's not simply a lack of availability of housing. But I am determined to try and make a positive impact in this area. But I think while we do that, I think keeping this hostel open will make a very positive contribution towards the emergency response that's needed. So hopefully we'll be successful in securing that extension of the lease.
Thank you, Minister. I now move on to adjournment debate number 2.